Good morning and welcome to this congressional briefing with the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. Today we are delighted to welcome Colonel John Spencer to join us. For those of you who are new to the Brandeis Center and its congressional briefings, I will say that we are a public interest advocacy organization founded a dozen years ago to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. Our primary mandate is to fight anti-Semitism on American college campuses. And for that reason, people have sometimes asked us why from time to time we have addressed issues abroad, such as military conflicts involving the state of Israel. In our law school programs, where we have had law school chapters as well as law school fellows, we have for many years sponsored a variety of lectures and topics involving humanitarian law, human rights law, laws of war, and we have done it because our students find that in responding to anti-Semitism, they have to address misinformation and distortion about the state of Israel in ways that are often colored by stereotypes and defamations about the Jewish people. In our congressional briefings, as we have looked at anti-Semitism on college campuses, in the corporate boardroom, and elsewhere, we're also concerned, post-October 7, in the ways in which the fallout from those atrocities have deeply harmed Jewish Americans on and off college campuses. But there is also a question of the extent to which anti-Semitic distortions have made it difficult for us to understand what is happening abroad. In other words, attacks on Israel can inflame tensions in the United States, but at the same time, stereotypes about Jews can make it difficult for us to understand what's happening in Israel and to have a clear-headed view of this. Too often, double standards are used based on ways of looking at Israel as the collective Jew that resemble the way in which Jews have been defamed historically. For that reason, we're particularly delighted to have this event. I will leave to my colleague, the Rabbi Dr. Mark Goldfeder, the honor of introducing our guest in beginning this event. Rabbi Goldfeder is, among other things, a senior counsel at the Louis D. Brandeis Center. He has been a teacher at Emory Law School. He heads another organization called NJAC. He is a scholar as well as a lawyer and a litigator. And I'm pleased to turn to Mark Goldfeder.
Good morning, everyone. It is truly an honor to be sitting here with the legendary Colonel Spencer, Chair of Urban Warfare Studies at West Point. Colonel Spencer is perhaps the most important voice in this entire conflict. And undoubtedly, he is the most important voice that most people have not heard but need to hear. That's because everyone likes to say, well, you should trust the experts until it comes to a topic about which they have a strong preconceived notion. Actually, that's exactly the time when you really should trust an actual expert. And when it comes to the laws of war, especially and including urban warfare, well, our country has no greater expert than Colonel Spencer. It's also very important to know that Colonel Spencer, unlike 99% of even other experts in this field, is not speaking in theoreticals. He's gone twice now, I believe, to Gaza to watch and to see and to experience. There's an old Talmudic saying, there's no comparing the power of something actually seen to something merely heard. And Colonel Spencer has actually seen the tunnels and the 360-degree hellscape that Israel is fighting in. In early November, Colonel Spencer, you wrote what I believe was your first article on this war in Israel on CNN. And the title of it was, "I am an expert and Israel is upholding the laws of war." I imagine that the article came out of the same frustration a lot of us were feeling reading some of the non-expert opinions on Twitter or seeing them on TV. But in that article, you really laid out some of the most important ideas that everyone, from laymen to lawmakers, need to know. The idea that war is hell and civilian death is tragic, that the number of reported deaths doesn't make it disproportional or any other war crime. You you talk about necessity, distinction, proportionality, and honor, about how hospitals or schools can lose their protected status when they are used by Hamas for a military purpose. And so with all that intro, Colonel Spencer, if we can we start at that article in November? Maybe you can unpack some of these ideas for our audience.
Sure, and thanks for having me. A really important conversation, even as of this morning. So I wrote that article at the beginning of the war as somebody who had studied over a decade of every urban-centric war that's ever been fought, U.S. history or anybody's history. And I'd actually been to Israel many times before studying Israel's past urban wars, to include in Gaza. But the overwhelming narrative, even to begin on October 8th, were things that you can't do this, you can't do that, or even a misconception of the word proportionality. That's really what drove me to write that article, where, like we've talked, the law of war is actually pretty straightforward. Where there's lots of problems with interpretations of the law, what the law actually says and what it means is actually really straightforward, like the use of even waging war, like Israel did, which was, say, because of the October 7th attack, we declare war against Hamas in Gaza in accordance with the UN's security, what the UN charter that says for an act of self-defense, you just have to notify the UN, you don't even have to ask permission. And then everybody said, we're taking the numbers, and this is the first war where I've ever seen just numbers in general be used to convince people of law of war violations, when, again, that's not the way the law of war works. Proportionality, even in waging a war, is you can do the proportional response to achieve what it is the war started. So in this case, it's to remove the imminent threat to your survival. So to stop the rockets from falling, to retrieve the hostages, and remove the threat. So proportionality, everybody was using the death toll of October 7th, which is horrific, and I went there last December, and again to walk many of the locations, to look at them through a military lens. But that proportionality of the deaths on October 7th have nothing to do with the war, although every civilian life, no matter what the reason, is a travesty. That proportionality means you use the proportional amount of force to remove the threat in existence of, and that's understanding what Hamas is. And then in every strike, people were saying that the number of bombs dropped, the amount of destruction, all of this meant that it was disproportionate. And they were using the term like it was a legal term. Like even in the conduct of a war, proportionality means, again, you're making an assessment of what you're targeting. It's a military target, it's a valid military target, and then do you use proportional response to hit it based on the military value? You also calculate the collateral damage. And this is just where the narrative has kept gaining in momentum, as in war, you have to use proportional response to achieve the goal. And this is where, like I was saying, that the interpretation of law is where everybody's gone, I think, the entire narrative very oddly in a wrong direction, as in the results of the action are the determinant factor of whether it was legal. No, it's determination of what was the target, what was the amount of force, what was the military value, what did you calculate the collateral damage at the time of the action. And this is unfortunately where I've seen to include it in the beginning of the war, the photos to convince people of some type of legal question. I mean, every urban war I've ever studied with the context of an urban defender, even if you try to precisely use only precision-guided munition, the images are similar based on the context of the war, and it doesn't determine legality. But that was starting on like October 8th, 9th, 10th, is in this is not legal, it's not proportional. So that article, I was just trying to, the basics of what are the 4 fundamentals of the law of war, and how are they interpreted? Because that's where I think the problem is.
Yeah, and I go so far as to say I think it's also incredibly dangerous when people confuse terms like asymmetry with proportionality. It actually incentivizes Hamas to use human shields, because when you can build up the number of dead people and know that people will misconstrue that as making it somehow quote-unquote more disproportionate, it actually ends up killing more innocent civilians. You mentioned seeing things from a military perspective. I know that, like many of us, you watched the videos of Hamas atrocities, and you referred to it once as seeing the face of evil. Particularly, you talked about the children they killed. Can you tell us, so when you watched the attacks, and we might not have seen, what did you see from a military perspective and the way that they were carried out?
Yeah, so I watched the October 7th video, and then I sat in a Starbucks for like 10 hours trying to write what I had seen, despite that I've traveled the world in the war zones. I was in Bucha, Ukraine 2 weeks after the massacre was discovered. I've had my own combat tours. I've never seen the things that I saw in that video. To start off with, was the video also is from a Hamas, it's 90% Hamas videos. To see all the Hamas members so gleeful about what they were getting ready to do or in the act of doing it. I've led soldiers into combat multiple times, and I've never seen that. Soldiers are very somber about going into battle, and this seemed to be some type of celebration for them. And even in the act. And there were a couple things in the video that really shocked me, and again, I've seen evil up front, and especially about the children. There's a scene in the video, which I wrote about in the article that I wrote about what I saw, where after Hamas had thrown a grenade into a shelter, 2 young boys come out of it wounded. And you can hear them in the video, because it's a CCTV video, you can hear them making what I call the death moan. And I've actually heard people on the battlefield, enemy on the battlefield, make that death moan as they're about to die. I never heard it from a 7-year-old boy, and I have young children, so it really shook me that not only were these kids making that death moan, but the Hamas member who had dragged them back into the house stood by and watched. It's not natural for me, even as a soldier who has had to kill enemy forces, to see somebody standing above kids making that death moan happy. And this is the scene where he goes to the refrigerator and grabs his Coke and starts drinking as they're talking to each other, the 2 boys, about, I can't see out of my eye, Dad's dead. It really shook me, the evil that I saw, and I likened it to Jeffrey Dahmer, because really I can't understand the individuals who did it from a military lens. They weren't soldiers fighting because I understand what it takes to be a soldier. This was almost like some type of psychotic serial killer, but like thousands of them, in my opinion, based on what I saw, and after walking the ground, which I did after that video of like Faraza, the Nova Festival, about how systematic and military the actual killing was conducted.
Speaking about walking the ground, so you've said that people need to stop comparing the war in Gaza to other conflicts. There really is no precedent. Can you tell us a little more about that, especially in terms of the urban aspects?
Sure. I mean, I think people need frameworks. And even in the beginning, like the Battle of Gaza City, I was trying to help people understand by comparing it to the Battle of Mosul, which was a battle, one of the 2 biggest battles against ISIS, where ISIS had taken the city of Mosul, about 1 million people, and you prepared it for 2 years for defenses. So I tried to use that as an analogy to show people. So then people started taking the numbers from Mosul, which was a battle that the U.S. military helped 100,000 Iraqi security forces defeat 4,000 ISIS in a city of 1 million. It went horribly for many reasons. But 10,000 civilians were killed, 10,000 Iraqi soldiers died trying to take the city back from an ISIS defender. I was trying to use it as just to give people the context of what it's like to fight block by block in ditch urban terrain when you have a defender who can't be convinced to leave the terrain. Because that's a history of urban warfare too. You can actually surround a city, convince them that they should give up because there's no use. But if they defend, and you have to go block by block. But even Mosul fails in any real metric to compare to what the Israel Defense Forces faced in Gaza. So in Gaza, the IDF faced over 30,000 combatants, just from Hamas. It doesn't even count for the Islamic Jihad, Lion's Den, or other terrorist organizations in there. 30,000, but also in a vast underground cities, basically, that they had built for 15 years. And I've written about this too, that even I, as an underground warfare, urban warfare expert, got it wrong on what was in Gaza. But no military has faced that level of a combatant in urban terrain with that level of underground facilities, so 15 feet to 300 feet underground, now estimated about 400 miles, where no military munition can reach some of those. At about 300 feet underground, you can't, there's no bunker buster that will reach down there, especially if it has to go through urban facilities or buildings, things like that. The fact that there's rockets emanating out of the cities, I've never seen that in any urban battle I've studied from World War II, World War I, where there's rockets emanating out of the combat area headed towards the soldiers' cities behind them. And that's to do with the proximity if nobody's ever been. And then lastly, the hostages. There's actually only one battle that I've ever studied in the history of urban warfare where there's a close similarity. And I've written about this as well, is the Battle of Manila. So in 1945, after we had left the Philippines and went back as the American force to liberate the Philippines, there were 4,000 American and British prisoners of war, but also civilians, men, women, and children being held in the city of Manila, which is, again, a very dense city that we actually helped build. So very strong buildings of over 1 million people. And when we went to liberate the Philippines, General MacArthur gave the U.S. military the order to go to Manila, get our people, in paraphrasing, but basically said, go to Manila, free the prisoners of war and the hostages. So there was a city of 1 million. There were 17,000 Japanese Navy defending the city, and they were going to defend it to the death. There were 37,000 attacking American forces, and it took only 3 weeks, but even MacArthur didn't want the American military using air power, so he restricted the use of air power. And initially, any unobserved artillery rounds, because he loved Manila. His dad served there, he served there. It was the pearl of the urn. He didn't want it destroyed. But because of the way the Japanese defended it, it took 100,000 civilian deaths. That's how many died at the Battle of Manila. 100,000 civilians. Because the Japanese were going to fight to the death, and then actually none of them surrendered. So 17,000 Japanese died because of the fact that they would commit hara-kiri once they realized they couldn't fight back. But Manila had hostages, which were all liberated after 2 years of torture, starving, everything. They had underground networks. So they had sewers and they had dug tunnels. They had heavy weaponry, and they were willing to die in place. And that's what it took. And that's the only comparison that I have, but we have a heuristic problem, especially in America, where we want to compare to what we know. So we want to compare it to the global war on terrorism against, even when there's a few instances, there's only 2 for the US military, the Battle of Fallujah and the Battle of Mosul, which we didn't even fight at. In our greatest battle, like the Battle of Baghdad, the enemy didn't resist, and it wasn't a big battle. So the Battle of Fallujah in 2004 for us was the biggest battle of the Iraq War, of the entire Iraq War. And the Battle of Mosul is the biggest battle since World War II, the biggest urban battle. And neither one of those come anywhere near the metric of what Israel faced in Gaza because of what Hamas built. And you said human shields. So I teach urban warfare to division level staffs. And I actually used before this war, Hamas as the example of the use of human shields, which has also been kind of not really explained to people what that means. It means that not only did they put people in front of them, but they designed their strategy to use that civilian population as a shield from the use of force against them. Because when you enter urban terrain, the laws of war, everything, the Geneva Convention say there's a lot of restrictions on the use of force in urban areas. So terrorists over decades have learned that, well, I can use that to my advantage, use human shields, and use protected sites, and this which leads to the hospitals, like the fact that there hasn't been a hospital that the IDF have gone to that isn't full of Hamas. They actually used it as a design. But what's unique to Hamas, and again, which does relate back to Manila, is that Hamas uses human sacrifice, where their strategy is actually to get as many people killed as possible. And of those 100,000 civilians that died in the Battle of Manila, a lot of those were killed by the Japanese, who were literally massacring the civilians during the battle and stacking them in the basements. because they wanted as many people to die as possible, which gets you to the use of a number, which maybe we can talk to about. But Hamas is the only combatant that I've seen. Even ISIS didn't do this. ISIS tried to keep people, even in the Battle of Mosul, in the city to help restrain the use of force, but they weren't stating, like verbally, that they wanted as many Iraqis to die as possible. But Hamas says it. They actually say it in their words: we want as many people to die as possible to achieve our ultimate strategy, which again is a uniqueness. So this is where all those comparisons that people still try to do, which also leads to alternatives, that people think there's another way. Maybe we can talk about that. I've heard, and I'm writing about, there's an ideal that commando raids, strategic bombing, precision bombing could achieve the goal separately than clearing or large assaults on the urban areas, which is just never been validated by any military history. Definitely not the global war on terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I wrote that article saying, just stop comparing them, because just by reasonable academic or sensible thinking, there is no comparison.
What is your reaction to the numbers coming out of Hamas?
They have been, let's say, at least skeptical. Because I've never studied an urban battle. And I've studied them for over a decade, let alone my own battles, where you can have, even if it wasn't the enemy providing the number, where you can have a daily running count of how many people have died in a battle. It just never happened. So that it's historic because it's never happened in the history of war, where you can have down to a single digit the number of people that have died. Even in that Battle of Mosul, again, with the U.S. military supervised and provided the air power, a year later, they still did not know how many civilians died. They were estimating between 10,000 and 40,000. They settled on 10 to 11,000, but there's actually on the ground reporting that a year later, they're like, we don't know. Because that's not the way it works. Just think about the complexity of urban terrain, let alone knowing how many people are in your population. I face this in my own wars, when you go to a neighborhood and try to find out who has a roster of everybody. But I've been very skeptical, one, not just because it's just not possible during a war to have a daily running civilian casualty count down to the single digit. And two, which I wrote about in my article that published yesterday morning, is that the number doesn't include any combatants. And in war, there's only two categories. So we can talk about civilians, which I'm fine with. But in war, there are combatants and non-combatants. Non-combatants are protected. You do not target civilians. In your proportionality assessment, collateral damage assessment, you do not disproportionately allow for collateral damages. But in the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry number, which even if you took it, there is 0 combatants. So not a single Hamas member has died in the war according to that number. And initially, like back in November, mass media and other people would say that the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry number, unvalidated. Eventually that went away, and it just became the death toll in Gaza is this. And again, daily running number, where, look, it's horrific that every civilian death is a travesty, but are you saying, by the people who keep running with the numbers, not a single Hamas member has died in Gaza? Which, again, I've been on the ground. I just got back from Khan Yunis, Gaza, about a month ago now, and that wasn't what I was seeing on the ground.
And talking about civilian casualties, in January, you wrote an article explaining that Israel has implemented more measures to protect civilian casualties than any other nation in history. And again, just yesterday, you wrote another piece in which you asked the question, Israel has actually created a new standard for how to conduct urban warfare. Why will no one admit it? Can you talk a little bit about the measures Israel has implemented that for some reason people don't talk about?
Sure. Well, I can't answer why the people don't. Well, I have ideas on why. I can talk basically from an evidence-based perspective. Why do I keep saying that? It's because, again, I'm like one of the few people who's ever studied the history of urban warfare, to include our own U.S. military-led battles, and have an understanding, even within the community of civilian harm mitigation, is what they call it. What are the steps? What are the best practices? There's a handbook written by civics and civilian casualties in war, basically civic, that shows what are the best practices, although there are some context to those best practices. So the biggest civilian harm mitigation step that's ever been taken in war is to evacuate the civilians out of an area before a battle starts. It happened in World War II during the Battle of Aachen, which is one of the few U.S. military actions, and both the U.S. and the Germans evacuated the city 2 times, so a total of 4 times the city was evacuated, and still about 10% of the civilians just refused to leave. But that's usually the best practice. In the last 20 years, even though in that Battle of Mosul in 2016, the Iraqi government told the civilians to stay because they didn't have a place for them to go. So they told 850,000 people, stay in the city, to stay away from the main combat areas. Eventually, they made a decision to evacuate. But that's really the best recommendation, is to surround the city, give time for evacuations, provide an evacuation corridor, and empty the city of civilians so that when you enter, you can say with a lot more confidence that if you're left, you still have to go through all the laws of war, basically a positive identification on who is a combatant. And usually they'll tell you they'll shoot at you in that contest. But the emptying of cities is pretty much the number one civilian harm mitigation step. And then we've developed ways like dropping flyers. So this is what Israel did in northern Gaza when, again, on October 10th, I remember clearly they said, well, you can't evacuate 1 million people from a combat area. It's just not possible. It's not the history of urban warfare. Of course it's possible. How long does it take is a question. And Israel got criticized for saying 24 hours, I think because nobody was moving when the calls went out. But dropping of flyers is pretty much the standard, right? So you give notice, you do the evacuations, you drop millions of flyers. And as a matter of fact, in the Battle of Mosul, we dropped flyers. The U.S. military helped drop flyers, but the Arabic was wrong. So the people who picked them up knew it was not from the Iraqi government, so they used it for other things rather than the evacuate, because the Arabic was a Jordanian dialect, so they didn't use it. But Israel, unique to Israel, and this is what I said in my first article, and I said it again in my article yesterday, went well beyond that, as in they do what's called phone calls. They have a practice called roof knocking that, again, the U.S. military doesn't do, which is where you call, you know you have a building you want to hit because it's enemy infrastructure, whether there's an intel center at the bottom of it, a tunnel underneath it. But Israel would call the building and everybody in it and say, you need to evacuate this building, it's a military target, you need to leave. If they didn't leave, they would drop small munitions on top of the roof. It's called roof knocking. They're not explosive, they're basically low yield explosives. And to warn people, and then later they would strike the building. We've never done that in war, period. As in we, the U.S. military or Western force, have never called a building, an enemy building beforehand, and told everybody to evacuate. So basically telling the enemy to evacuate as well. Israel started doing that in northern Gaza at the beginning. As the war continued, and the evacuations continued, they did it less. They also put soldiers in a room like this, hundreds of soldiers, and had phone numbers into the city, and they were calling imams and business leaders and everybody, trying to get them on the phone if they knew they were in the city, to get them to help encourage people to evacuate and get out of harm's way. So I put in my article that it's like over 7 million pre-recorded phone calls, like 5 million direct phone calls, like 17 million texts into the city to tell them to evacuate. So all those electronic measures, just because we do have a capability now, like Amber Alert, where we could blast all cell phones in an area, but we've never put soldiers on the phone and called into the civilian population and told them, please evacuate, you're in harm's way, and go this way along this route to this area. When I went to Khan Yunis, though, I saw the IDF had started issuing their own maps out. Never been done in the history of war. Just period, never been done in the history of war. Where I actually teach militaries to develop these maps and to cut the city up into pieces and name every building, name every area, so that you can control your forces, because blue on blue or military on military is a real threat because of how dense the urban area is. Well, the IDF decided to give that map to the civilian population and to Hamas, to give their maps to Hamas, and then use the map to direct people even at a very local level, especially when they went into Khan Yunis. We're going to be operating in Area 818 today. Please, if you haven't evacuated, stay away from this area. So they used it for evacuations, but they also used it to tell the civilians to stay away from an area, even if they were still in the area, and tell the enemy where they were. So this gets to telegraphing every step that they are making, which is you don't want to be cold about it, but all of these steps, I argue as well, from the history of war could actually lead to more destruction if you didn't do it. So if you think about actually, if you stop comparing Hamas to a terrorist campaign, because yes, Hamas is a terrorist organization designated by the US and multiple other countries. It's also an army, like a full army with complete infrastructure, military capabilities, military units. In past wars, if you recognize this is a war, not a counterinsurgency, not a counterterrorism, Western militaries want to end the war as quickly as possible and to do what's called maneuver warfare, where we not only move with such speed and overwhelming force, but also with surprise. Because going back to Sun Tzu till now, surprise is still vital in war. But in the IDF's approach to the war in Gaza, there's like, we will give up almost all elements of surprise in the pursuit of limiting civilian casualties, and I argued in my article yesterday, to what? Like, what is the number? Since the law of war, there is no number. And actually this civilian to combatant ratio, although I've been studying it for over a decade, and I can point to all these different battles where I can show you different numbers, but I've never seen a war in which those numbers are somehow used as a moral validation for the political will, or a moral evidence of disproportionate illegal actions. It's interesting from an academic perspective. I've never seen the numbers used like that. And I think we talked about it before. Yes, the U.S. military in almost every operation that I've talked about has been accused of war crimes. In the Battle of Mosul, the Battle of Fallujah, almost all the same people, air wars, World Health Organization, have said almost the exact same things about you're indiscriminately bombing, you're using the wrong type of munition, you shouldn't even be in an urban area. The Amnesty International said it was illegal to be in an urban area during the Ukraine war. It's crazy. But I've never seen, so I have, like, that's normal. Because people don't understand war, or they're legitimately human rights activists, which is fine if some people believe there should be no war, period. I got that, but don't twist the narrative to mean that it's illegal to fight a war in general. But when the US was accused of all those things, it never rose to an immediacy or in such a political risk, because all war is will, right? And Israel needs the will of the population, the international community. And that's the way wars are fought. And matter of fact, the US military lost the will of the international community in the first Battle of Fallujah, which is a small scale of what's going on in Gaza, where the US military, 4 American civilians were killed in the city of Fallujah, and the US president ordered the military to go in. But because Al Jazeera, mainly, and the terrorist organization was inside the city, broadcasting out false numbers of civilian casualties and disproportionate use of force, the US military stopped the battle 6 days into it and completely lost the war, or the battle at least, because the world thought it was disproportionate use of force. And then, so they went to a different model, which was the second Battle of Fallujah, which is 6 months later, where they emptied the city of 90% of the population, just like Israel did in Gaza, northern Gaza, and went in and still destroyed most of the city because of the enemy's actions. But the immediacy of the implications of the political environment are unique to this war.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, you sort of hit on whether or not you see a double standard when people talk about Israel in this context. I know that from the anti-Semitism perspective, it's not unexpected to see that, but it's interesting to hear that from a military perspective as well. I want to shift to talk about Israel's goals. We know that Israel's goals in this war are very simple and clear: destroy Hamas, bring back our hostages, and secure the border. Do you think that Israel can win this war?
100%. I think it's very close to winning the war. That doesn't mean that there is not a continued day after. But from a war perspective, and especially from an academic perspective, the war has a start date, and it was actually October 7th. Yes, you can absolutely disagree with the Israel-Palestine situation and all of its variables and the history of it, all that. From a military perspective, The war started on October 7th with the invasion of southern Israel. I've written about that. With intentions to do much more. And then, in accordance with all international law, Israel declared war against Hamas in Gaza and stated 3 definable, measurable goals: bring the hostages home, destroy Hamas as a military organization with military capability to hurt Israel, and secure the border. I know we won't have time to talk about Hezbollah attacking on October 8th and continuing to attack, but from a military perspective, those measures, so has the IDF been effective? One is, it's not abnormal for the world to say you can't destroy an ideal. This is the ISIS thing, where our mission actually as the US military was annihilate ISIS, was the order given to the military. Not even destroy, it was annihilate, which included a shift to, instead of trying to kick them out of cities, to surrounding them and destroying them. You can absolutely destroy a military organization by any metric and prevent it from reconstituting itself. You can take away its rockets, you can destroy a great majority of its tunnels, you can take away its weapons manufacturing capability. By every metric, Israel has cleared dense urban terrain, taken terrain away from Hamas, has destroyed Hamas military organizations and military capabilities, to include stuff that nobody even knew existed. Nobody thought that there were weapons manufacturing plants 200 meters underground. They thought most of it was being smuggled in. But that's an immense military capability that you have to take away from Hamas as you systematically clear, while also bringing civilian harm to a historic low. And people can have opinions, but data is data. A historically low number in any context of urban combat, and continue to take away Hamas's military infrastructure. So I think that absolutely Israel can win the war. At the beginning of the war, I was asked, how long will it take? How long will it take to win the war? And by win, by definable metrics. Yes, it's hard to beat an ideal, but I can absolutely take a military's ability to conduct military operations away from them. And they have to go into an actual insurgency, guerrilla, underground thing. But they don't have they don't control terrain, and they don't have military capability. I was asked, how long would it take as an urban warfare expert in the beginning? And I said, there's too many variables. I can tell you how long it took in other battles, given the context, like the fact that it took 9 months to clear the city of Mosul. And the IDF cleared northern Gaza, which includes multiple cities, very big cities, in 2 months. So I would have underestimated, actually. I did. I didn't think it was possible to do it that fast. But my answer to that question has always been, how long do they have? Because war is ultimately a contest of will. And I couldn't have predicted the overwhelming, you could call it groupthink, on what is possible in war, especially given the variables of the urban combat, underground tunnel networks that nobody has seen. Yes, they exist in China and they exist in Northern Korea, but it's just never been seen in wars today at this scale for that purpose. Because I think this is the other part. Yes, they're winning. I think they can do it if they have the time. Because there is the challenge, which again, you can't go into Rafah because there's 1 million people there. That's the exact wording that was given at the beginning of the war. You can't go into northern Gaza because there's 1 million people there. There's 1.5 million. Absolutely, you can. And in Khan Yunis, when I was there last month, I saw with the IDF what I didn't even think was possible, which is to be able to do it in the midst of the battle without even firing a single shot, surround the population, evacuate them, and identify the Hamas who have been trying to get out through the civilian population. And I wrote about that yesterday as well. Absolutely, they can do it, and absolutely they can do it with a historic low civilian casualty rate. Will they bring it to 0? Which is, I've been accused of saying that Israel has created the gold standard of fighting in urban warfare. I don't think that's true, because I don't think there is a gold standard, because that means 0 civilian casualties dead. I don't know what the gold standard is. I can tell you by any academic metric or even military metric that they've brought it down to a level that's never been in the history of urban warfare. But what is the standard? The standard is to follow the laws of war, prevent civilian harm, and even what's called constant care. Take constant care. When I was in Khan Yunis, I saw the IDF doing things that I didn't even think were possible in that surrounding an area, then call for evacuations through your lines, which is very dangerous to do, and then use like facial recognition and things like that to identify Hamas and quietly pull them to the side because they're no longer fighting at that point, and just pull them to the side. They're still active combatants. This is the other misconception of war too, is like people woke up and started watching wars. You don't have to you don't have a weapon in your hand and firing at somebody to be a combatant. If you're a member of Hamas, terrorist organization, especially if we have facial recognition and all this of you, you're a combatant. It's just a fact. So you'll be taken as a combatant. So absolutely they can achieve the victory. Absolutely, I think they're close. But how long do they have is the greater question.
Just to put a number on that, I think they've destroyed their last count 18 out of 24.
They say 19 now.
19 out of 24 battalions. So it is a measurable metric, and thank God they're on their way.
But here's and I didn't mention it, is that war is about killing and destruction, but war is about strategy too. So the IDF have had a strategy to achieve their political goals. Hamas has a strategy, and they always get a vote. Hamas built an entire. I used to say that Hamas built their tunnels under all the schools and the hospitals and everything to do what's called lawfare, to use the laws to work in. But come to find out, no, what they actually did was they built the schools on top of the tunnels. So they didn't build the schools under the tunnels under the schools. They actually built the tunnel first in military industry and then built the school on top of it, which is unique. Hamas's strategy has never been to fight the IDF. It has only been, and by every bit of design, and they spent 15 years designing it, it's only been to cause what is happening, which is the international community to tell the IDF to stop. That was the case in the Yom Kippur War, in the Six-Day War, and almost every one of Israel's wars that they didn't start in self-defense, is that somebody will come in and say, usually the United States, like, I understand you have the right to, you need to stop. Hamas studies history as well. So their entire strategy is to get their civilians killed, to air the photos of the destruction, and it was to move with the civilians as the civilians move, but it's ultimately to survive. As somebody who taught military strategy at West Point, if Hamas, as in that senior leadership, they don't care if all of their 30,000 military members die. If that Hamas top echelon survives the war, even if they somehow escaped and went to some other country, they achieve a victory in this war. It's a strategic victory by every definition, both in their grand strategy and their strategy for the war. If they can say they survived, they did October 7th, survived IDFs, they'll become giants in the world of terrorism. And this model of attack Israel, wait for the incoming, have Israel stopped, will be repeated because it worked.
We don't have that much time, but I know you did mention, people I think aren't aware necessarily that Israel is fighting an existential threat on two fronts.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the north?
Sure. So I got the chance to, I'd been to the north. I'd actually been in Hezbollah tunnels along a few years ago, which are a lot different than Hamas tunnels. But I went to the north, and I didn't even have an understanding, as somebody who studies it every day, of the extent of attack that Hezbollah has conducted since October 8th. So on October 8th, Hezbollah began striking northern Israel. And by striking, I mean massive numbers of rockets. And they haven't stopped, although they don't make international news. I went up to what's called the blue line, which is the line between Israel and southern Lebanon. I didn't understand that they not only sent rockets in, they took out every camera along the border. They actually sent Hezbollah forces across the border. And then I went into the cities, basically, in northern Israel that are completely evacuated to this day, because over 80,000 people in the northern can't physically be there because they're under a threat of rocket every day. And even the belief that the Iron Dome can hit them all. I stood in a place in Shtula last month where the Iron Dome didn't get the rocket because the enemy always gets a vote and he's always trying to find a way around. But I don't think people really have a grasp of how much Hezbollah is attacking. And by any other metric, it would warrant a full war of self-defense. But Israel has had to hold as the existential threat of southern Israel. It clearly is clear and present, but people are discounting that they're also fighting a two-front war. We were worried that there would be a two-front, three-front, four-front, or even a five-front, like like the Six-Day War. But we're not even acknowledging that Israel is currently fighting a two-front war. And there are 80,000 people, and every time I've gone to Israel, I've gone to a hotel, and it's full of people who are, for now 6 months, children, men, women, and children from northern Israel who can't go home to this day because of those attacks, to include yesterday, rockets, striking northern Israel.
What other questions do you think people should be asking that they aren't asking about this conflict?
I mean, I think it's good to continue to ask this, what does the end of this look like? And this is, I don't think people are asking enough, like, what is Hamas's goal? Of course, we all want the humanitarian crisis, the civilian casualties, we want it all to stop. One, that a ceasefire would mean Hamas victory. So I would think people would ask more, like, what does a Israel victory look like? And they've defined that. Hamas is actually defining what victory looks like for them as well, but nobody puts that in the news. I mean, the Hamas military and political leadership have multiple times held news conferences on what their goals are. The ultimate destruction of Israel and the death of all Jews. The Hamas military leader in Gaza has publicly said, I will repeat October 7th until the job is done. So their only goal is to survive, that they want all of their civilians to die. Nobody's ever talked about the fact that, like I've been in Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, tunnels aren't new, but like in Ukraine, the tunnels, the subways, which are dual purpose, the civilians sought refuge in them from the bombing. All 2.5 million Palestinians in Gaza could fit in Hamas tunnels with ease. There's over 400 miles of tunnels. They could all fit there, and not one of them have been allowed in that tunnels. The only civilians who are allowed in Hamas tunnels are Hamas senior leadership family members. And we just saw one video of that. So I would ask, like, what does Hamas want out of this war?
And with the incredible amount of disinformation about this war, especially on social media, we've seen massive upticks of anti-Semitism, people with very thinly veiled anti-Zionistic anti-Semitism. And your articles in particular have been incredibly helpful in many instances in trying to respond to that and to stem the tide and say, look, what we're seeing on the ground is wrong. Do you have any advice in terms of countering that kind of false narrative that we're seeing spread across, and unfortunately even into the halls of Congress?
One, so there's, I mean, that's a big one. I try to do it with, like, I'm not pro anything. I'm pro fact. So I've been writing because I've had a unique opportunity to study this type of war, to include in Israel for years. I can't fix stupid. So those are people who just don't want to learn. They just want to get their information from sound bites or TikTok videos. Or that's like a whole category of people. But those who actually are able to critically think, it's to do the actual due diligence to identify what are the facts on the ground. And this is why I couldn't sit in the United States and make assumptions about what's going on. And every time I've gone to Gaza, I've been completely surprised that even my decades of research, I wouldn't have guessed. Like the Hamas tunnel that I was in, which is 100 meters outside the border, that was a massive invasion tunnel that I couldn't have imagined Hamas had the ability to build. So one is that people aren't doing confirmation bias, right? So they're looking for information on actually what's happening on the ground, whether that's the number of food trucks going in or the number of civilian casualties compared to the number of Hamas combatant casualties, to when they say Rafah, do you mean Rafah City, Rafah refugee camps, the Rafah district, southern Israel, southern Gaza, like what are we talking about? It's a critical thinking problem. I agree with you that it's because of that anti-Semitism, I think, unique so that the truth can't get air. Where some of that's where if it bleeds, it leads. But even me, I used to do 20 interviews a day with mass media. I do 0 now. Because I'm not in the narrative of everything that's going on there is bad. Despite I'm the only one who's been a couple places that other people haven't been. But nobody asked me. So I don't know how to fix it. I've been hoping that despite all that criticism, And again, why I was in Khan Yunis is that the IDF had continued accomplishing the mission. And you would still telegraphing every move has had success. I mean, now when you fight a war, you want to take the enemy's strategy away, right? So Sun Tzu said, like, the greatest strategy is to one, to win without fighting, and two, to take your enemy's strategy away from them. So the use of civilian casualty numbers, the IDF have had to find a way to clear urban terrain with very few civilian casualties. And they've had to find a way to go into the tunnel, something they never imagined they wanted to do. I've never seen the military do, use the tunnels against the enemy, their own tunnels. So I don't know how to fix it, but I hope people will seek out different information than just one narrative.
To that end, your institute at West Point is incredibly helpful. I recommend everybody would visit that and learn from Colonel Spencer and his colleagues. I think we have time for a couple of questions before I'll turn it over to Eliza Lewins. Maybe we'll just go across to the time point. Yeah.
So I've seen a lot that a ceasefire would be a Hamas victory. Could you elaborate on why it would be a Hamas victory?
Sure. Yeah. And people use the term ceasefire in different ways. I was actually very supportive of the temporary pause that happened before for the hostage exchange, even though the numbers were I would have done the same thing. The reason I say that a permanent ceasefire and a stopping of the operation would, just as I defined, be an ultimate Hamas victory. It'd actually be an Iran victory as well, as Iran use of proxies in the Middle East will have validated a strategy of building a proxy force with immense capability to attack Israel or the United States in the area. And then the narrative of the international community would be so strong that you couldn't respond and they would survive. If I were to play this out, if there was a ceasefire that was permanent, and that, again, that top 10% of Hamas that's sitting in southern Gaza right now survives, they will, of course, because they say continue to build capability through all partners, Iran, Syria, others, to attack Israel more. But they'll become giants in the world of anti-democracy, anti-Israel, anti-anything. That's why I think a ceasefire would be a complete Hamas victory. One, because they said it's what they want. They just want to survive to achieve their grand strategy, which makes it really difficult to imagine anything different than a complete destruction of Hamas as it existed on October 6th.
Michael Oren, Israel's former ambassador to the United States, has said that when Israel, at the beginning of the war, or after Hamas attacked, when Israel had mobilized 360,000 reservists and regular soldiers, that what it should have done was control Gaza, because Hamas is not an existential threat in short, medium term the way Hezbollah is. It should have attacked Hezbollah and cleared out the north, then finished or taken care of Hamas. What's your analysis? How do you see that?
I wouldn't agree as from a military or strategic perspective, as in, yes, Hezbollah started attacking on October 8th, but this is, again, a misconception of what October 7th actually was. The scale of it and the purpose of it, the fact that 4,000 rockets rained down, which overwhelmed the Iron Dome in the first few hours of October 7th, I wouldn't agree that it's not an existential threat, but again, the variable that few people talk about is 240 hostages were taken. So that strategy would have meant leave the hostages and the awful things that were happening to them to continue. Because again, this is the context of, you can't compare this to other wars because of the imminent threat, not just to southern Israel, and it took multiple days to even secure the border, let alone stop the rockets, but the fact that the hostages, you'd ultimately, of course, launch. And I haven't written this article because it would sound cold, is what would America do? What would America do? And I don't even have to do the comparisons as in like per capita attack, right? So if you just took the numbers, what would America do if an army invaded our border, killed 1,200 men, women, and children, took 240 hostages back into their territory, and then we're launching nonstop rockets on Los Angeles? I'm pretty sure that would be viewed as a clear and present imminent threat to our survival, and we would launch overwhelming force. this is where I've disagreed, again, I don't get political with some of the analysis. Of course, militaries use overwhelming force to achieve their goal. And one of the reasons is to bring it to an end quickly. And what would America do if that same scenario had happened to us, is that we would use overwhelming force to achieve 3 clear objectives: secure the border, bring the hostages home, and destroy the other force that's attacking us, especially raining down the rocks. We would launch, in my opinion, a very destructive bombing campaign to ensure not a single rocket emanated from the enemy territory against our civilian sites. That's just pretty much fact, like not based on history.
Okay, time for follow-up?
It's very brief.
Okay, so the flip then is, should Israel have used overwhelming force, I mean much less concerned about civilian casualties, in the early days in Gaza to achieve its objectives as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I can't prove, we do these things called postmortems where you predict whether it would have gone differently had you done it differently. I think it was the right decision, one in understanding the Israel Defense Force system. And I think most people don't understand what it is. It's not a conscript force, it's a citizen army that does take time to mobilize. And again, people, rightfully so, and I've been studying October 7th in great detail, not understanding what the attack on October 7th even did to the military. In the Southern Command, the Gaza Division, everything. I don't know if they would have had the capability, but I think it was the right thing to do to wait to evacuate the cities. Understanding how embedded Hamas was underneath the civilian sites. So there was no military target. So that's the challenge, is like, what would overwhelming force have looked like? There's not a single Hamas military installation in Gaza. There's not a single one. Like, what do you strike? It looks like you're striking only civilian sites because Hamas only built its stuff under civilian sites.
I apologize. Colonel Spencer is in high demand, has another event that he has to get to. Everyone is welcome to stay and to mingle and to eat. I want to just, before I turn it over to the president of the Brandeis Center, Lisa Lewin, I just want to thank Colonel Spencer again for your incredible service and for your scholarship and for your leadership and for your bravery in speaking out on these issues. And with that, I will turn it over to
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Colonel Spencer. I just want to add, when you talk about what would America do, and you say, imagine if we'd been invaded, 1,200 killed, over 200 taken hostage. The additional piece to add to that is, and what if there were rockets that were continuing to rain down on our citizens so that our citizens were internally displaced, which is what you mentioned, right? Israel has, right, the citizens in the north, citizens in the south who weren't able to go back to their homes. And so I think when you talk about what Israel's goals are, first and foremost, their goals were to secure their borders and enable their citizens to safely go back to their home. And on the other side, their opponents, right, were ones who were committing to repeat that October 7th every chance they get. And you have to remember, when you talk about a ceasefire, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. And then October 7th breached that ceasefire. So to suggest then, when there's a question about why would this be a victory for Hamas, if you're going to leave Hamas so that Hamas is able to repeat October 7th, then you have not secured your borders, you have not protected your citizens, you have not enabled your citizens to return. And as we're talking about, this is not only in the south, there is essentially a second front going on. And so even when the southern border may be secure, and when Israel, if it reaches its goal of ensuring that Hamas cannot repeat October 7th in the south, they still have to worry about what happens in the north with Hezbollah, who has also pledged, right, that they would like to continue this and have similar goals. And so for Israel, the ultimate goal in this war has to be able to make sure that its citizens can live safely, which is what I think America's goals would also be. And as you mentioned, Hamas not only has this goal, but embeds itself in the civilian population, wearing civilian clothes. I mean, I think one of the reasons why the figures can talk only about civilian casualties is because most frequently the Hamas fighters, as even some of the videos show, are not wearing military uniforms. They're not wearing fatigues. So they blend in. They're not only shooting from the hospitals, shooting from the schools, shooting from within the civilian neighborhoods, but they're dressed in civilian clothes. So this is just, as you've so well articulated here today, an extraordinary challenge for the Israelis, and we're very grateful to you for coming today, sharing your expertise with this group. We're grateful to you for coming today and for listening and engaging in this conversation.